Danger in Diablo, Chapter 1. Desert Travelers. Steady now, target. The slim young girl in the worn leather jacket reined her horse to a quick stop and reached into the saddle scabbard for her rifle. Her blue eyes narrowed as she lifted the Springfield to her shoulder and took careful aim. This was one shot she must not miss. On the sun-scorched desert road behind her, the small boy on the driver's seat of the canvas-covered wagon brought the mule team to a sudden halt and sat watching hopefully. 20 yards ahead of the girl with the old single-shot rifle, a skinny cottontail rabbit bounded across the road toward the thin shade of a clump of sagebrush. He was small and he moved very fast. Annie Oakley's rifle spoke sharply. The rabbit jerked to a stop in midair, then tumbled to the ground. Annie sighed and lowered the long gun. She always hated to kill the little desert creatures, but she and her 10-year-old brother had been on short rations for several days now, and food had become a big problem. "Good aim, sis!" Tagg scrambled down off the wagon and ran ahead to his sister's side. "You sure don't waste any lead." Annie smiled down at the happy freckled face as she reloaded. "I should hope not, and when you're old enough to start using guns, you better not waste any either. You don't always get a chance for a second shot." She dropped the rifle back into the saddle boot and started to swing down from the saddle. She was smiling as she stood at Tagg's side with her arm lightly over his shoulders. She was glad he had no idea how close to the end of their supplies they had come. Now they could have a good meal before they went on. As they stood there together, the girl was not much more than a head taller than her brother, though in the saddle she had seemed quite tall because she carried herself so erectly. She was nearly 17, and almost anyone would have called her pretty, although her features were not classically beautiful or even especially well matched. Her mouth was just a little too wide. It was a generous turned-up-at-the-corners kind of mouth, and her eyes, set far apart, were a little too big for her slender face. They were grayish-blue with a few flecks of brown, and looked honestly out of a pleasantly tanned face that was framed by 2 looped-up braids of sun-gilded hair. Her divided tan riding skirt was fringed with leather and decorated in a neat pattern of nail heads. The worn leather jacket matched the skirt, but it had been faded and streaked by long days of traveling under hot desert sun. Her homespun plaid shirt was open at the throat, and her silk kerchief was knotted at her neck, ready to draw up over her nose and mouth when the sand started blowing. She was wearing a gun belt, the buckle of which was marked USA. The holster that hung from it held an Army Colt revolver, long-nosed and heavy and fully loaded. It was a strange weapon for a slender young girl to be carrying, even in the wide, wild desert of the old Southwest, but it was her most prized possession, and she could handle it just as expertly as she could handle the old Springfield rifle. "When are you going to let me do some shooting?" The lad in the patched blue cotton shirt and faded overalls had asked that question at least twice a day for the last 2 months or more, and his big sister had answered it in exactly the same way every single time. "Pretty soon now, honey," she'd always said. This time she added, "right after we get there." Tagg looked startled. "Honest?" "Cross my heart," she assured him, and solemnly went through the motions. Whoopee! Tagg broke away and did a cartwheel on the sand. It wasn't a very good cartwheel because the sand was slippery, but it helped blow off steam. Annie laughed and applauded. Tagg wiped the sand out of his eyes and grinned. "Now that's over," she smiled. "How does rabbit stew sound to you?" "Boy!" Tagg's mouth was watering already. "With onions and potatoes and no beans." "Why, Tagg Oakley." Annie kept a straight face, but her eyes danced. "The last thing you told me when we started west was how much you liked beans. If I remember right, you said you could eat them 3 times a day and never get enough." "But that was 2 whole months ago, sis, and we've had 'em for supper every single night since, except when those miners back at Red Rock Junction swapped us that hunk of deer meat for one of your apple pies." "Not deer meat, venison." "Whatever you call it, it sure was tough. My jaws hurt for a week trying to chew it." Annie laughed. "I hope the miners didn't have the same trouble with my pie." "No fear. Nobody makes better pie or dumplings than you, Annie." That last sounded like a hint. "Stew with dumplings. Yum!" Tagg rolled his eyes and grinned hopefully. She laughed and tousled his sun-bleached hair. Tagg winced, but for once he didn't pull away. There was too much at stake. "How about it, huh? Is there enough flour left?" "Sure, you win the dumplings. Now run fetch that rabbit and we'll rustle up a meal before we roll on again. I figure we'll still have several miles to go before we sight that stage station Uncle Luke marked on our map, and the animals all need a short rest out of this sun." It was rough, rocky country whose giant boulders rose up out of a sandy wasteland. The only sign of civilization was the narrow wagon road that wound across its wide floor between the distant jagged peaks of the desert mountains to the north and south. There were few trees to give shelter here, although a few hundred yards away there was a stand of cottonwoods that seemed to indicate that an underground stream flowed deep below the sand and rocks. Annie unharnessed the mules and gave each of them a pail of water dipped out of the barrel on the side of the wagon. Then she left them in the shade of a pile of boulders and took the same care of Target. The fine cow pony drank daintily and nibbled at a bag of oats, with an air of doing it just to oblige his mistress. Annie gave him a hug and a lump of sugar before she hurried back to the wagon to start cooking their lunch. Tagg had a fire started and was preparing the stew when she joined him. They worked at it together, as always, but it was Annie who made the dumplings, with almost the last of their flour. It was a most successful meal, but when it was finished and the last dumpling had disappeared, Tagg was just too full to help clear away. Annie excused him and sent him for a nap in the wagon. He protested sleepily, but she insisted that she needed the exercise, so she would let him off this time. Besides, he had acquired a new rip in his last pair of blue jeans doing that cartwheel, and Annie refused to let him ride into Smoke Tree Station this evening all rags and tatters. As she sat cross-legged in the shade of the wagon, Annie stitched and thought happily of the wonderful change these last 2 months of rugged travel across country had made in Tagg. When they had left their home in a small Midwestern town, he had been thin and puny. She had often wondered, at first, if she had done right to start out on such a long and maybe dangerous trip with him. But instead of hurting him, it seemed to have done him good. He had grown an inch taller at least, and he was strong enough now to handle the balky mules like a veteran mule skinner. They had met friendly folks along the way, ready to give them a hand when the going got tough, so they had no real trouble on the road. 10 days ago, they had left the main overland trail and were heading southwest across desert country on a little-traveled road. They were close to the end of the long journey now. The desert country was not new to Annie Oakley. As a child, she had lived at several far western army posts with her father and mother. Her father, a colonel in the cavalry, had seen to it that the tiny girl was taught to ride almost as soon as she could walk. When she was 7, her small brother had been born. The colonel and Mrs. Oakley made happy plans for the family's future. They would find a fertile valley somewhere in this new country and start a small cattle ranch. After the Indians were subdued, Colonel Oakley would retire from the active service and raise blooded cattle on his ranch. The children would grow up strong and healthy. It was a lovely dream. And to prepare Annie for that wonderful life, Colonel Oakley had insisted on training her with a rifle and a six-shooter when Tagg was still only a baby. Perhaps he had had a premonition, perhaps not. He wanted to be sure that she would be capable of taking care of herself wherever they lived. So when she was hardly 10, he had let her ride with his troop whenever the Indians were peaceful. And he had let his scouts teach her how to trail in rough desert country, where a broken twig or a mark in the sand could tell a whole story to the expert. Then, suddenly, when she was only 11 and Tagg was a very tiny 4, their mother had died in a fever epidemic. She had insisted on caring for the sick children of some of their troopers and had caught the sickness herself. The stunned colonel had taken his children back to the small town that had been his childhood home and had left them in the care of distant relatives. Then he had gone back to his duty on the wild frontier, a sad, silent man. After that, he had come to see Annie and Tagg whenever he could get a long enough leave. He had done what he could, but most of the care of her small brother had been on Annie's shoulders, and she had lavished affection on him. He had scarcely realized that he was motherless. Annie had tried her best to make up to him with her loving care for any lack of mothering he might have felt as he grew up. In the past couple of years, the colonel had been stationed at a fort in the Black Hills, where the Sioux were still actively battling the endless procession of gold seekers and settlers that streamed through their hunting grounds. He had been unable to spend time with Annie and Tagg, but he had written many letters to them both. Lately, he had been reviving his dream of someday settling on a ranch with his family. He had even picked a site at a beautiful location on a fork of the Green River near Old Fort Bridger. He wrote to Annie to keep up with her practice with the rifle, and next time he came home he would start Tagg learning how to fish and shoot. But there was not to be a next time. Instead, a letter had come from Washington telling Annie that their father had died gallantly while leading his troops in defense of a wagon train of settlers. He had died, but he had saved the settlers. It was something Annie could be proud of, when it stopped hurting so much. A tin dispatch box had come with that letter. A few personal possessions were in the box, letters from her mother, yellowed and worn from much rereading, his campaign medals, and his big gold watch that he always called his turnip. Some day, when Tagg was grown up, Annie would give him that watch. She knew he would prize it above anything else and would wear it with pride in memory of his father. The army Colt that now swung heavily on Annie's hip had been in the dispatch box, too. Tucked under everything else, there had been a letter addressed to Annie and Tagg, to be read in case of my death. In his letter, the colonel instructed them briefly, get in touch with your mother's brother, Luke McTavish, in a town called Diablo in the southwest part of the Indian Territory. He is a sheriff there and a good, substantial citizen. I am sure he will be glad to open his home to you both. It was only at the end of his rather curt note that the colonel allowed himself to express some of the love that he had for his motherless pair. He was not accustomed to soft words. Even on paper they sounded awkward and ill at ease. Annie, keep on taking good care of your brother until the day when he is grown and can take his place as your protector. You have done an excellent job. If God wills that I do not see you again, I want you to know that I have always been proud of you both. Your affectionate father, Jared Oakley. When the first shock was over, Annie had taken stock of their situation. Their father's relatives could not keep them on there, and Annie had no way of making a living for herself and Tagg. Tagg had taken the loss of their father hard and had grown thin and pale. Nothing seemed to interest him. Annie decided it was high time to write to their uncle at the strange-sounding town in the territory. Her letter brought a quick reply. Uncle Luke was delighted to have them come and live with him. He sent money and a map he had drawn of the long road they would have to travel to get to Diablo. He urged them to start as soon as they could find someone reliable to travel with. Annie had tried to find a party going west, but no one seemed to want to be burdened with a young girl and a small boy. So at last they had cheerfully started out alone, with a span of mules to pull their wagon load of household goods and supplies. They had taken turns riding target and driving the wagon all the way across country. Their map had not proved to be as accurate as Uncle Luke must have thought when he sent it to them. He had left out several high mountain ranges and a couple of wide rivers. But Annie didn't blame him too much. She knew he had based the map on reports from many travelers, and it was natural that they would remember the details differently. On the whole, though, the map had helped a lot. And now, on the last leg of the journey, the map covered ground familiar to the sheriff himself, his own county, and she knew she could rely on it. Turn here, he had penciled at a dot marked Smoke Tree Station, Diablo 15 miles southwest by Stage Road. So with any luck, they would be there soon. A light breeze was flapping the canvas that stretched over the furniture in the wagon. A faint, distant rumble came from the mountains that fringed the wide valley floor. Annie noticed with a start that the sun was already halfway down the sky, and Smoke Tree was still miles off. She stared anxiously at the mountains. Huge fluffy clouds, like giant puffs of whipped cream, hung over the jagged peaks of the highest range. Their billowy tops were snowiest white, but down below they were a dirty gray, and she could see forked flashes of lightning there. The crash of thunder was louder now and more frequent. She thought uneasily of the giant cloudbursts that sweep down the barren sides of the desert mountains to roll in a terrifying wall of water across the flatland, carrying a wildly tumbling mass of uprooted trees, great boulders, and sand with it. Not even the strong mesquite and the spiked cactus could stand against the dreaded flash flood, and there is no way of knowing when it will come roaring down and what direction it will take. This particular storm might not mean danger, but she had no intention of waiting there to find out. She gently shook Tagg awake. While he was rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, she brought the reluctant mules and started to harness them. "While I hitch up," she suggested briskly, "why don't you trot over to those cottonwoods and see if you can pick up some kindling? We've used up all we had in the wagon." "Sure, sis." Tagg was ready any time to explore new places. "But hurry," she warned. There was no use mentioning the storm in the mountains. They would be out of its path in a short time if they started moving soon. "And if you don't find any right handy, come back. I want to get rolling so we can be at Smoke Tree Station before dark." Tagg was already loping off towards the stand of cottonwood trees a few hundred yards away. Annie turned back to the balky mules. "I know," she told them. "It's a lot nicer sleeping in the shade than pulling this heavy load. But you'd be a heap more uncomfortable if you got in the path of a big, husky flash flood." And she backed them firmly into their harness. Target was pulling at his rope when she went over to saddle him. She fed him a lump of sugar from her pocket and scratched his ear. Target nuzzled her and whinnied affectionately. Then he snorted suddenly and gave her a nudge with his nose that nearly knocked her hat off. "Okay," she laughed. "I can take a hint." She untied his hitch rope and started to throw on his saddle. "And don't act so innocent. I know you did that to hurry me." She had the saddle in place and was tightening the cinch when she heard Tagg calling excitedly. His voice was faint in the distance. "Hi, Annie! Come see what I found!" She looked toward the cottonwoods, but he was not in sight. There was a low sand hill beyond them. She swung lightly into the saddle and stood in the stirrups to look over it. Now she could see him. He was bending down to study something in the sand, but what it was she could not make out at that distance. She chuckled to herself. Tagg was always making some big discovery on this trip. Sometimes it was a centipede or a shiny millipede with all his legs going at once as he tried to get out of the reach of the small, curious boy. Sometimes it was only a small chuckwalla lizard blinking at him from a rock or scuttling away fast over the hot sand. Once Tagg had grabbed for one of them and caught it by the tail. To his horror, the tail came loose in his hand and the chuckwalla kept on going. Tagg was very near tears that day, thinking he had injured the little fellow beyond repair, but Annie explained that a new tail would grow in place of the one he had pulled off. Whatever it was that Tagg had discovered this time, he was very excited about it. He was scrambling to his feet and starting off on a run toward a mesquite thicket a few yards beyond. Annie started up Target and headed after him. Halfway there, she cupped her hands around her mouth and called, "What are you after?" Tagg paused and looked back. "Dunno yet," he yelled. "I'm trailing it. Come on!" He started off again. Now he had reached the thicket and was pushing through. She could see that he was standing close to the edge of a deep, rocky ravine which she had not been able to see before. "Take it easy there," she called, but Tagg grinned back and waved, and then started down out of sight. She pulled up where he had been bending to study the ground, and saw the mark that had excited him. It was a curious S-shaped trail in the soft surface of the sand. Along the curve of the S, the sand was ruffled as if a piece of rope had been looped and dragged heavily across it. The strange mark was repeated many times between here and the edge of the ravine. Somewhere, a long time ago, she had seen a trail like this, and for some reason the sight of it now sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was connected with something scary, but what? She hastily tried to recollect. Her father had taken her for a walk in the desert, she remembered. She had run ahead through the sand to pick some wildflowers for her mother. Her father had shouted something, and then he had fired his big pistol. She remembered that the smoke got in her nose and made her sneeze when he picked her up in his arms. Then he had showed her that mark in the sand, and he had said— Suddenly she remembered what it was he had said. "Tagg!" Her voice sharpened to a scream. "Tagg, come back!" There was no answer. She prodded the surprised target into a run across the soft sand. He floundered and snorted indignantly as it gave way beneath his hooves. But Annie, with voice and slapping rein, urged him on desperately, and somehow he managed to find his footing again and ran. She had not reached the edge of the ravine when she saw Tagg. Apparently he had slipped as he started to climb down. He had stopped his fall by clutching the projecting roots of a sturdy mesquite. Now he hung there, only a foot or two down, gripping it with both hands. To let go would mean a plunge of 20 feet to the rocky floor. But why didn't he try to pull himself up, she wondered. Then she saw. Coiled on a flat rock that jutted out from the side of the slope was the desert creature whose odd trail he had followed, a horned rattlesnake. The sidewinder was drawing its ugly head back above tightly wound coils, its slitted eyes fixed on the boy's white face. In another moment it would strike. Annie had no time to stop to take aim. Without slackening her speed, she made a lightning-fast draw and pulled the trigger of the heavy Colt. Her shot smashed the reptile's head from its body. A second shot swept the writhing coils off the ledge and down into the ravine. She pulled up to a sliding stop a few feet from the edge and threw herself off the pony, smoking revolver in hand. As she ran, she called, "Hang on, Tagg! Hang on tight! I'm coming!" Tagg hung on. He had no intention of letting go and maybe dropping down into the ravine with the dead snake. He remembered hearing that snakes usually go in pairs. Its mate might be waiting down there. Annie knelt at the edge and reached down to grasp Tagg's wrist while he scrambled to get a foothold among the loose rocks. She braced herself and hauled hard. In a few minutes he was safely up over the edge and sprawled breathlessly on the ground. As soon as she was sure he had not been hurt, Annie stood off and looked him over disgustedly. "Of all the silly tricks," she began. "Look at you. You've torn your shoe, and that's a bad rip in your shirt sleeve. Well, this time you'll just mend it yourself, young man." She was mad, all right, he decided. He was still a little shaky as he got to his feet and tried to brush off the dirt. He avoided meeting Annie's accusing eyes. She pointed to the wagon standing way back on the road. "Taggart Thompson Oakley," she said sternly, "get back on that wagon this minute, and if I ever catch you trailing a sidewinder again, I'll—" She broke off suddenly, reaching out and grabbing him in a big hug. Tagg squirmed and protested, but she held him tightly a moment. That was a close call he had had, much too close. "Aw, Annie, let go!" One minute she was scolding, and the next she was hugging. Tagg much preferred the scolding. Just as suddenly as she had hugged him, she let go and gave him a good strong shove toward the wagon. "Scoot," she said cheerfully, "and next time you're sent on an errand, don't wander off on any side trails. They usually get folks into trouble." Tagg grinned back to her. "I promise, Annie, and thanks for being the best shot in the world."